My name is Evangeline Hart. I was 26 when everything changed, though for most of that year I would have told you my life was small and steady, the kind of life you don't notice until it's gone. I lived in a narrow blue house on Larkspur Lane with my husband, Daniel, and I let him believe I was exactly what I looked like. A freelance graphic designer who clipped coupons out of habit, who drove a used hatchback with a crack in the windshield, who worried out loud about the electric bill in July. None of that was a lie exactly. It was just not the whole truth. The whole truth lived in a folder I kept in a safety deposit box 2 towns over, statements, trust documents, a name that wasn't mine anymore because I changed it when I was 22, the year I walked away from my grandfather's shipping fortune and the family that came with it. $72 million, give or take what the market did on any given Tuesday. I hadn't touched most of it in 4 years. I told myself I didn't need it. I told myself Daniel loved the version of me that clipped coupons. I met him at a laundromat, of all places, both of us waiting on the same dryer. He made a joke about a static cling, and I laughed for the first time in months. He didn't know that 6 weeks earlier I'd signed away my seat on my family's board. He didn't know I'd once been photographed at a gala in a dress that cost more than his car. He knew a woman named Eve who liked strong coffee and old paperbacks, who flinched a little when people talked about money, and he never once pushed to understand why. I used to think that not knowing was a gift I was giving him. Looking back, I think it was a wall I was building for myself. His mother, Marguerite, never liked me. She had a way of looking at my clothes, my car, my hands, like she was doing arithmetic, and the numbers kept coming up short. Daniel could have done better, she said once, not quietly enough at Thanksgiving. Daniel apologized for her in the car afterward. I told him it didn't matter. That was another one of my small lies. I want to be honest about something. I wasn't hiding my money because I was ashamed of it. I was hiding it because every person who had ever known about it had wanted something from me, had looked at me and seen a number before they saw a face. I wanted, just once, to be loved for the coupon clipping version of myself. I wanted to know if that version was enough. I didn't know yet that the answer would come from the one person I least expected to bring it, and that she would bring it, uninvited, to my own front door. It was a Tuesday in March, the kind of gray afternoon where the light never quite commits to being day. I was at the kitchen table, 3 coffee rings deep into a logo redesign for a client who kept changing her mind about the color blue, when the doorbell rang twice, sharp and impatient, in a rhythm I recognized before I even reached the hallway. Marguerite stood on my porch in a coat that cost more than my mortgage payment, holding her phone out in front of her like evidence. "I need you to explain this," she said, before I'd even said hello. On the screen was a photograph I hadn't seen in years, me at 21, in a navy dress, standing beside my grandfather at the unveiling of a cargo terminal that bore our family name. Underneath it, a headline from an old business journal, Evangeline Ashford Hart, heir apparent, steps back from Ashford Maritime Holdings. I felt the floor tilt very slightly, the way it does in dreams where you're falling but no one around you notices. "Where did you get that?" I said. Not a question. My voice had gone flat and careful, the voice I used to use in boardrooms before I forgot I used to be someone who spoke that way. "My book club," she said, and there was something almost triumphant underneath the outrage, like she'd caught a criminal instead of her daughter-in-law. "Linda's granddaughter is in finance. She recognized your maiden name in a filing. $72 million, Evangeline. Is my son married to a stranger? I should have invited her in. I should have handled it the way I'd handled everything else in my life since I left that world, quietly on my own terms, with the door closed behind me. Instead, I stood in the doorway with the cold air moving past my ankles and said nothing at all, and in the silence I watched something in her face shift from anger into calculation, the way ice shifts before it cracks. "Does Daniel know?" she asked. And there it was, the question I'd been avoiding for 4 years, standing on my porch in a stranger's coat, asked by the one person who had never once tried to know the real me, only ever what I was worth. "No," I said finally. "He doesn't." She smiled then, and it was not a kind smile. "Well," she said, "he will." I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Daniel and listened to him breathe, slow and even, unaware that his mother was somewhere across town composing the sentence that would end the life I'd built for us. I thought about the day I left Ashford Maritime. I was 22, sitting in a boardroom that smelled like leather and old money, listening to my uncle explain, kindly, the way you explain something to a child, that a woman's softness wasn't suited to hard decisions, that perhaps I should consider a smaller role, something ceremonial, something that photographed well. I remember the exact second something in me went quiet and cold and certain. I signed the transfer papers 3 weeks later. I kept my shares. I gave up my seat. I changed the way I introduced myself to the world. I never told Daniel any of it, not because I thought he'd react the way my family had, but because I was terrified he might not react at all, that the money would simply become the most interesting thing about me, the way it had for everyone else, and that our small, unremarkable life, the one with the cracked windshield and the coupon binder, would quietly stop being about us and start being about it. There's a particular kind of loneliness in loving someone and choosing, every day, not to be fully known by them. I told myself it was protection. Some nights, staring at the ceiling, I let myself admit it was also cowardice. In the morning, I made 2 cups of coffee, the way I always did, and set one across from Daniel at the table. He looked tired, the good kind of tired, the kind from staying up reading a novel he wouldn't tell me the ending of because he wanted me to read it too. "Eve," he said, using the name he'd always used, the small soft syllable that had never once, in 6 years, felt like an alias to me, only like home. "You look like you didn't sleep." I opened my mouth to tell him everything. And then my phone buzzed on the counter, once, twice, a third time, and I saw Marguerite's name above a message already sent to a group chat that included Daniel's entire extended family, the words visible even from across the room. "Someone has something to tell you all about Evangeline." The choice I'd been protecting myself from making for 4 years had just been made for me. There is a specific silence that happens when a phone buzzes in a room where 2 people are already sitting in careful, unfinished honesty. Daniel's phone was face down beside his coffee. Mine was already lit up in my hand. I watched him reach for his, and I understood, with the strange calm of someone watching a car accident from just outside its radius, that I had maybe 4 seconds left of the life I currently had. He read it twice. I watched his eyes move across the screen and then lift to me, and there was no anger in his face yet, only a kind of quiet, dawning confusion, like a man recalculating the shape of a room he thought he already knew by heart. $72 million, he read aloud, not really to me, more like he was testing whether the words would make more sense out loud. "Ashford Maritime. Eve, is this about you?" I didn't reach for an excuse. I think some part of me had been rehearsing this moment for 4 years without admitting it, because what came out was simple. "Yes," I said. "It's about me." I told him everything. Then in the kitchen, with the coffee going cold and his mother's messages still lighting up both our phones in the background like distant thunder, I told him about my grandfather, about the boardroom, about my uncle's voice calling me soft, about the day I signed the papers and drove until I found a town where nobody knew the Ashford name. I told him about the laundromat, and how meeting him had felt like the first honest thing that had happened to me in years, and how I'd been so afraid that the money would make him look at me the way everyone else always had that I'd chosen, again and again, small silences instead of a truth. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I started preparing myself for the version of this where he stood up and walked out the door his own mother had walked in through. 4 years, he finally said, not shouting, just tired and a little lost. 4 years, and you thought I was going to be like them? I didn't think that, I said. I was afraid of it. That's different, and I know it's not fair to you. He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face I couldn't quite name yet, not quite hurt, not quite forgiveness, settled into place. I need to think, he said. And he left the kitchen, left the phone buzzing, left me sitting alone with a truth that had finally, after 4 years, found its way into the daylight. Marguerite came back 2 days later, this time without knocking, letting herself in through the side door the way she always had, as though the house had been hers first. I found her standing in my living room, studying the family photos on the mantel the way an appraiser studies furniture before an estate sale. I assume you've told him everything now, she said, not turning around. I have. Good. She finally faced me, and there was no pretense left in her expression, none of the wounded mother's performance from the porch. Then we can speak plainly. Daniel has always been soft, financially. He's never once asked me for anything, which I used to think was pride. Now I think it was simply that he never had anything worth asking for. That's changed. I understood, then, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, exactly what this had always been about. Not betrayal. Not concern for her son. Access. You want to know if there's a way in, I said. She didn't deny it. I want to know what kind of woman marries into a family and hides $72 million from her own husband. I want to know what you're planning to do with it. And frankly, Evangeline, I want to know what's in it for the rest of us. I could have raised my voice. Some earlier versions of me, the boardroom version, might have. Instead, I found myself very calm, the way I imagine my grandfather must have felt in the rooms where he'd built his empire, the version of steadiness that comes from finally not caring what someone thinks of you. There's nothing in it for the rest of you, I said. There never was going to be, whether or not you found that article. Daniel and I will decide together what our life looks like now. You are not part of that decision. You were never invited to be. Her mouth tightened into something bitter and small. We'll see what Daniel says about that. We will, I agreed. But it will be Daniel who says it, not you standing in my living room deciding for him. She left without another word, and for the first time since she'd shown up on my porch with her phone held out like a verdict, I didn't feel afraid of what she might say next. I felt, instead, something I hadn't expected, a kind of relief, the specific relief of a door finally closing on a room you should have left a long time ago. That night I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to my grandfather, who had been dead 3 years and would never read it. Because some truths are easier to find when you're writing them for someone who can't interrupt. I left because I was tired of being loved for what I could become useful for, I wrote. I built a small life because I wanted, once, to be chosen for nothing. I think I forgot, somewhere along the way, that hiding and choosing aren't the same thing. I think Daniel deserved to choose me with his eyes open, and I never gave him the chance. I didn't hear Daniel come in until he was already sitting across from me, reading upside down without asking permission, the way he used to read my design mock-ups over my shoulder before I'd finished them. You never showed me that side of yourself, he said quietly. Not the money. That. The way you think about it. I was afraid if I let you see all of it, I'd stop being Eve to you. I'd just be the money, like I was with my family. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee mug slowly on the table, a habit I'd watched him do 1,000 times without ever once wondering what it meant. I married a woman who was worried about the electric bill, he said finally. I love that woman. I still love her. I'm having a harder time with the 4 years of not knowing than I am with the 72 million, if I'm honest. The money doesn't scare me, Eve. What scares me is wondering what else you decided I couldn't handle. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in years, and it landed harder than any anger could have. Nothing else, I said. That was the only room in the house I kept locked. I'm sorry I didn't trust you with the key. He reached across the table then and took my hand, not forgiving me all at once, not pretending the last 2 days hadn't happened, but staying. Choosing, in that small, unglamorous gesture, to stay in the room and keep talking instead of walking out the door his mother had already used twice that week. We didn't fix it in one night. Trust doesn't work that way, and I'd have distrusted any version of a story where it did. But over the following weeks, something steadier began to take its place. Long conversations at the kitchen table, a visit to a lawyer's office where I finally, for the first time in 4 years, said my full legal name out loud without flinching. I called a family meeting of my own, the first one I'd initiated since I left the boardroom. Marguerite came expecting, I think, an apology, or at least a negotiation. What she got instead was a woman who had stopped hiding and, in stopping, had also stopped being afraid. Here are the terms, I told her, and Daniel sat beside me, present this time, aware this time, no longer a bystander in his own life. This money isn't a family resource. It isn't leverage. It's mine, and increasingly, it's ours, Daniel's and mine, to decide together, privately, the way any couple decides anything. You will not be consulted. You will not be informed. If you contact either of us again about it, that will be the last conversation we have. You'd cut off your husband's mother over money, she said, aiming for wounded and landing somewhere closer to caught. No, I said. I'd cut off anyone, related to me or not, who showed up on my porch treating my life like a portfolio to be evaluated. That's not really about money, Marguerite. It never was. It's about the difference between people who want to know me and people who want to know my balance. She left that meeting angrier than she'd arrived, and quieter than I expected. I don't know if anything I said reached her, but I know it reached me, the sound of my own voice, steady, unafraid, saying out loud the thing I'd spent 4 years too frightened to even think clearly. It's been 8 months now. The blue house on Larkspur Lane still has a crack in one window we haven't gotten around to fixing, and I still drive the same hatchback, though we finally dealt with a windshield. We didn't buy a mansion. We didn't quit our jobs. Some things about our small life, it turns out we didn't want to trade away, not because we couldn't afford to change them, but because they were never really about money in the first place. They were about the version of us that existed before anyone else's arithmetic got involved. What did change was quieter than that, and I think more important. Daniel knows all of me now, the Ashford name, the boardroom I walked out of, the 4 years I spent hiding a locked room inside myself out of fear instead of love. He knows, too, that I chose, eventually, to hand him the key instead of waiting for someone else to break the door down. Marguerite doesn't come to the house anymore. She sends a card at Christmas, brief and formal, and Daniel and I have made a kind of peace with the distance, the way you make peace with a window that lets in a little less light than it used to, but at least doesn't let in the cold. Sometimes, in the evenings, I sit at the kitchen table where all of it unraveled and rebuilt itself, and I think about the girl in the navy dress at the terminal unveiling, the one my uncle called soft, the one who signed her name away rather than stay in a room that only ever wanted to use her. I don't think she was running for money. I think she was running toward a life where someone might finally choose her without it. She found that life, eventually, not by hiding, the way she thought she had to, but by finally standing in her own doorway and letting the truth walk in. My name is Evangeline Hart. I was 26 when I stopped being afraid of being fully known. And it turned out, in the end, that it was worth more than $72 million ever could be.